This is Constructive Voices.
Constructive Voices, the podcast for the construction people, with news, views, and expert interviews.
Hello to you, and it is the third episode in this series with Nadina Galle. I am Jackie De Burca for Constructive Voices. Nadina is going to do a really quick introduction, but the proper introduction about Nadina and her career to date can be found on the first episode of this series, where you'll find out lots of interesting things that she's done up to date, and she's going to be doing loads more things throughout her life by the looks of everything. Now, we're covering her book, and we split it into sort of three different aspects of the information you're going to find in her book, and this episode is about the tools and techniques for better urban nature management and monitoring. Nadina, you're really welcome again. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie. Great to be here again. And hello, everybody. I'm Nadina Galle. I am a Dutch-Canadian ecological engineer. I'm a 2024 National Geographic Explorer, and most recently the author of The Nature of Our Cities, Harnessing the Power of the Natural World to Survive a Changing Planet. And it's lovely to be back.
Brilliant, Nadina. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, go to episode 1 and have a listen if you haven't already done so. Now, one of the things that really surprised me, Nadina, was to realise that you used to suffer from what's called plant blindness. First of all, we probably need you to delve into exactly what that means. But can you also talk about how you realised that you were suffering at that time from plant blindness?
Yes. I think it's kind of funny with plant blindness. This term has been around for a while now, but I saw recently on social media, there is this trend now to have all kinds of blindness, whether that be something called blush blindness or fake tan blindness. This idea that you are doing something and you don't even realize that you're doing it. And I think, like many people living in cities, despite having a very outdoors childhood, I realized that, walking through my local urban park, and I'm ashamed to say this, doing what I do, had a really difficult time identifying a lot of plant and insect and other fauna species that I shared my cities with. And of course, I'm ashamed to admit this because this is part of my work, but it got me thinking that this is something that I think, especially if you're not an ecological engineer, an urban ecologist like myself, you're probably, facing this more and more. And I was absolutely disturbed when I discovered this study that was done of both UK and US children that found that the average child was able to identify hundreds of logos and brand names, but not even able to identify 10 local plant or tree species. And I think that just speaks to such a broader societal trend. Actually, there's another really interesting research that goes on par with this that found that in the last 50 years, there's actually been less and less references to nature in our music and literature than we had 50 years ago, which I think is something really interesting too. It just speaks to the role of nature in our day-to-day society, in our day-to-day communities. How much do we talk about nature? How much do we reference it and its beauty and its majesty in our songs and in our literature and in our music? How much is it discussed at school and with our young ones? And it got me realizing, like, if this was something I was struggling with, considering my work, there's only more and more people that could be facing this. And it's so critical because I think it speaks to this broader trend where we don't really have a good idea of the role of nature and that it plays in our day-to-day life. And as we've seen from research, it's exactly these day-to-day interactions with nature that we desperately need, both for our own health and also for our safety from climate-related disasters.
Absolutely. I suppose the thing that comes into my mind, Nadina, when you're talking about that, is to bring it to the level of, like, we'll say a lettuce that, you might use in a salad. Like, a lot of the kids that I would interact with, I don't have my own children, but, obviously lots of friends do. They would see that you get a lettuce from the supermarket. So it's like nature is just taken out of the equation as to where where our food is even produced.
Right, right, exactly. I mean, there's kids that grow up in cities that think that milk comes from the supermarket. They don't even make the association with a cow. So it really goes to show how far removed we've become. And you could argue, like, who cares? Who cares that kids don't know about that? Why is that even important? And I would argue it gets at, the most existential, deepest roots of like what makes us human, like our connection to the earth and the food that we eat and the air that we breathe and the resources that we use. They all stem from the earth in one way or another. And once we've completely lost touch of that, well, I honestly really fear for the future of humanity in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just as you're talking, Nadine, it comes into my mind, if you think about the cave art, the art that you see, prehistoric art in caves, this was of animals normally. Not all of it, but a lot of it is of animals. So, when we think about it, it's only maybe 200 years or so of industrialization, and then going forward from there, how that's affected society. But before that, all of our ancestors were involved in nature on a daily basis normally.
Yeah, and I think that's why the role of city nature is so important, because as we as ancient humans experienced in those days, nature was very much a part of our daily lives. And I think we've gotten to the point where we feel we can fill up our nature cup on the weekends or on holidays with a trip or with a hike. And more research shows us that the real benefits of nature comes from those daily doses. And that it doesn't have to be these, vast expanses of wilderness. Don't get me wrong, those are incredible if you have the opportunity to visit. But getting a lot of these daily doses could come from a singular tree that is planted from outside your house, where you see the wind rustling through the leaves, where you hear the birds singing, where you see the ants climbing up the trunk. Like you have these daily doses. That is honestly really what makes up the majority of our lives.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with you, and I'm lucky enough, that I can access that. But of course, some people it's not so easy to do. One of the things that strikes me as being harsh but true, I suppose, is urban living equals, unprecedented biodiversity loss, but also strong biodiversity protects environment and human health. Now, that actually leads us on to the fact that there's been huge declines of obviously all sorts of populations, but particularly the insect population. Can you talk us through this, Nadine, and how it affects us?
Yeah, it's interesting because we can also see around the world that some of the world's biggest cities are actually um, started and have grown in some of the world's largest biodiversity hotspots. And I think that just says something. It's like, well, why are we drawn to biodiversity? Why do we want to settle in places that have high biodiversity? And I think we know that the more biodiversity, the more buffer we have from different natural disasters, the more opportunity, the more niches that we have to potentially exploit for different shelter resources. Medicines is a huge one, building materials, different food types. We want to live in places that are abundant with life and abundant with a variety of life. So I think it's interesting that in the course of human history, we've already been drawn to these biodiversity hotspots to create our cities and grow our cities. But of course, the way that we go about urbanization is also incredibly dangerous to biodiversity. It leads to habitat fragmentation, which is arguably the biggest threat to biodiversity itself when you're removing habitat. And of course, that fragmentation means that you're losing areas of natural migration. You're losing larger ranges for certain species of animals to be able to hunt or to gather their own resources. And particularly, one of the species that's most effective is our insect population, as you mentioned, Jackie. And, people often wonder, it's like, well, why would I care about insects? I care about elephants and tigers. And I understand that insects might not be the most charismatic of species that we have, but they are, in fact, they make up the fabric of the hammock of life. They are at the very essence, they are the world's biggest pollinators, which of course is critical for our food supplies. They are the biggest scavengers. They ensure the decomposition of organic matters that goes back into the soil and returns as new forms of life. And they offer this wonderful litmus test, or this biomarker for biodiversity as a whole. So what we see in areas that have decreased biodiversity, insect populations were actually the first to go. So you have this relationship where if insect populations decline, biodiversity as a whole declines. So it only makes sense that we really want to monitor and manage our insect populations to be able to provide a proxy for the management of other biodiversity. But the issue was, in the past, is that we lacked objective means to measure insect populations. I mean, the reasoning is quite simple. Insects are quite difficult to measure and to count. We've had multiple kind of citizen science initiatives that have helped somewhat, but they lack a certain, they're all quite subjective. So the market was ripe for an objective means of measuring insect populations so that we have this proxy for biodiversity as a whole.
So let's talk about the story behind the state-of-the-art insect biodiversity monitoring and how this actually functions.
Yeah, so that's a story that I cover in the book called the Diopsis camera. And the Diopsis camera is essentially a solution for this problem I just outlined, trying to devise it's basically, it looks like a small table, and on top of that table that you would put either in a meadow or on an agricultural field or on top of a rooftop in a city, anywhere where you wanted to measure the insect populations. It essentially is this small metal table. On top of it, you have this protected from the elements camera, and then you have this yellow landing pad. The reason it's yellow is that yellow is a color that tends to attract a lot of flying insects. So this camera, essentially how it works is it takes a photo every 10 seconds. And every time there's an insect on that yellow landing pad, it runs through the computer vision algorithm to identify not only the species of that insect, but also measure its biomass. And in that sense, we get a really objective means of measuring flying insect populations, which of course is already one of its limitations. It only looks at flying insects. But it is one of the best means that we have right now to initially measure insect populations. But secondly, also hopefully, I would say the main use case of this is to analyze if money and investment, and there's a lot of it recently, that's being poured into biodiversity measures and interventions are actually working. Because that, I think, the biodiversity feels so vague and so abstract. How do you even go about making sure that the money that you're pouring into it is actually helping? This is one way to do that.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, obviously, whatever funds or companies, that are investing in this, they want to see some sort of returns and be able to, discuss that within their own boards and obviously if they have, shareholders and investors and so on. So it's critical, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's mostly, a lot of these, it's government spending, so it's all taxpayer money. So, people want to make sure that in an era with so many different competing interests, just even in the environmental and climate front, that we want to make sure that we're spending our money wisely.
Something else that was very curious, we see ingenious adaptations by birds and mice on one hand, which I found really fascinating, but also on the other hand, there's new diseases and new dangerous behaviours of other creatures. Now, for example, one of the case studies that you speak about in the book is the discovery of the lighter colour of some snails, which has happened because they've adapted to their environment. How was this discovered, and what tools are now available in relation to this area?
Yeah, so this is bizarre. This idea of urban evolution is really been popularized by a Dutch scientist, an entomologist originally, but he's an evolutionary biologist. in the broader sense of the word. His name is Menno Schildhuizen, and he works at the Biodiversity Museum and Center called Naturalis in the Netherlands, in Leiden. And he has looked at so many different examples of this phenomenon, which he calls urban evolution. And so that could take, essentially what it is we previously thought that Darwinian evolutionary, we would not be able to see that in a human lifetime, right? We can't see evolution happen, which was, one of the core reasons that Darwin had so much trouble popularizing his theories, because people had a hard time believing that this could happen because they couldn't see it with their own eyes. And what we're seeing with urban evolution, in the shorter lifespans of species, like certain insects and like birds and like certain plants, we can actually see evolution in real time, as Menno Schildhuizen puts it. So an example of this would be that in cities, there are certain plant species that have actually evolved to drop their seeds closer to the mother plant than in previous evolutionary cycles, where those seeds, you would actually want them to be lighter and more easily catch the air so that they could disperse wider, right? Because that is the ultimate goal of evolution, is to disperse your specific species as wide as possible and exploit as many niches as you can. And this particular plant species has actually evolved to drop its seeds closer to the mother plant, because in asphalt, concrete ridden cities, you're more likely to establish if you drop closer to the mother plant, because we know that that plant has been able to root in some soil, versus you can disperse very far, but if those seeds land on asphalt or on the street, they're obviously not going to be able to succeed. So that's a pretty crazy one. Another one is crows that have actually started to vocalize at much higher frequencies so that they can actually hear each other over the sounds of traffic, which is really, really crazy to me.
It's amazing.
It's so cool. And so Menno Schildhuizen wrote this incredible book, one of my favorites, called Darwin Comes to Town. It's such a good title. And he has it's a book chock full of exactly these kinds of examples, and I could keep going because they're just so fascinating. But one of the ones
Go on. No, tell us more. Definitely.
One of these other ones that I think is so wicked too is like the coloring of squirrels. So squirrels have actually been, so you had so where I grew up in southwestern Ontario, you have the eastern grey squirrel, and you also have a slightly darker variety. So where I grew up, like in a much more forested area, like you would always see the gray squirrels. Like that was the most popular one. You would see that all the time. And then when I was 18, I moved to Toronto to study for my bachelor's, and you would see gray squirrels sometimes, but most of the time you saw these really like a much darker, almost black variety of these squirrels. So I started looking into that, and evolutionary biologists had seen that these black squirrels were coming more and more popular in city environments because you could see them better against the grayscape that is our cities. So the gray squirrels essentially were more likely to become roadkill in cities purely because of their color, because you can see them as well, versus these black squirrels, they stood out more. So there's more of these black squirrels. So it's just examples like that. It's bizarre because you can actually, like I said, you can see this in real time. You can see this over the course. And one of the examples that Menno was really interested in was this coloring of snails, specifically this model organism that's used in a lot of different ecological research, it's basically like your typical garden snail. And basically how he wanted to study this, and this is how a lot of urban evolution cases have been studied, is through the use of tons and tons of sampling, because you want to make sure that this is not just a one-off, right? You want to make sure that you can actually are able to tell evolutionary trends with a huge amount, more samples the better. But what do? You can hardly send out an army to get all of these different samples of these different plants and pick photos of squirrels and snails. So they used the power of citizen science, and they designed an app called Snail Snap. And they essentially invited people all over different cities in the Netherlands to take photos of this specific type of land snail. And that worked quite well because they're quite well known, they're easy to recognize, and they also don't move that fast, so they're easy to photograph. And they collected something like, I think it was 8,300 geolocated, and that was really important, geolocated images of these snails. And they again ran them through a computer vision algorithm, and they were able to see that the snails that were in dense city centers on average actually had lighter shells than those that were outside of city centers. Basically, this garden snail is now evolving into these two different varieties, and the one that lives in dense urban cores actually has a lighter shell because it's able to then deal with extreme heat better, with temperatures better. And I thought this was so interesting because essentially what it's done is it's made the color of its house, of its roof, lighter. And this is actually a mechanism that we see also humans do when we're not able to implement a green roof on our buildings. One of the most cost-effective things we can do is actually paint our roofs white so they're better able to reflect the light and therefore keep our homes a lot cooler too. So it's just funny, one, to see the power of citizen science in this, two, to see that snails are actually evolving in this way, and three, things that us humans can actually learn from snails.
It is absolutely amazing. It's really fascinating stuff, Nadina. When you think about like both the squirrel and the snail that you've just spoken about, like they have to evolve and have to somehow or other change their pigmentation, essentially.
Yes, to survive. And that's the crazy thing. It's like, and of course it is evolution, right? So essentially what that means is that snails that have had darker colored shells have tended to perish quicker than those that have lighter colored snails. So those are perishing. That means that the lighter colored varieties have more chance to reproduce. And over time, and of course, snails have shorter lifespans. Over time, which is more rapidly in a human lifespan, we're actually able to see that the vast majority of the snail population then has lighter shells.
Yeah, absolutely. So, such fascinating case studies that you're sharing in the book. There are other great tools as well that you feature. One is called Birdcast, and the other is EarthSnap. What are they, and who created them?
Yes, so EarthSnap was, I'll start with that one because it's similar to SnailSnap in the sense that it is able to identify species. Although EarthSnap doesn't just do that for snails, it does that for millions of flora and fauna species around the world. The inventor is Eric Rawls. He's originally from Texas, now lives in Colorado. And he originally started with something called earth.com, which was his main goal in life was to create this massive repository of photos and observations and information about every single species on Earth. That was his goal. Based on that information, he then started something called PlantSnap, which is still to this day one of the best plant identifying apps on the market. But after the success of PlantSnap, he wanted to go even bigger, and he decided to open up the entire earth.com repository to creating an all-in-one plant, flora and fauna identifying app. And he's now working very hard to grow that app. And he hopes, much like an app called iNaturalist, which is also used very widely and also much for scientific research, he hopes that this is something that we started the conversation with can really help to combat that thing that we call plant blindness. Because I do believe that it all starts with just knowledge and awareness and understanding, right? The more that we can understand what grows and what lives around us, the more we understand about it, the more we can care for it, and the more we'll do, hopefully, to protect it. So that's Eric Rawls and EarthSnap. And then Birdcast was actually developed by researchers at Cornell University together with something called Merlin. Merlin is another app that is actually, it's like a Shazam for birdsong. They're actually able to identify birdsong based just on birdsong. You have a recording of that, or you play it live or record it live, and it is actually able to recognize that and hopefully identify what bird that song belongs to. And this is just such an innovative way of doing it because, of course, as you can imagine, with things like with an app like EarthSnap, plants, easy to photograph. They don't move. Certain animal species, also easier to photograph. birds, very, very difficult. So to have something like
Yes.
Merlin is really, really exciting because it's also able to, what we're able to do then is we're able to take recordings in the middle of a park, in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a rooftop garden. We're able to take these recordings, and based on those recordings, we're able to actually identify which birds are in that area. And the way that they specifically do it with artificial intelligence is really interesting. They don't do it purely on the audio recording. What they actually do is they convert that audio recording into, I believe it's called is it called a sonogram, where you have like a visual depiction of that audio. And based on that,
Okay.
they're able to run their artificial intelligence and basically identify, okay, which sonograms are most similar to each other and which are most likely to belong to that specific bird. Again, none of these apps
Wow.
are perfect. None of them are a replacement for, a diehard bird watcher or a diehard naturalist, of course. But I think they're just a beautiful way to facilitate those first interactions with nature and with certain species that we live amongst that people might not otherwise be able to have.
Sure. No, absolutely. And again, you trigger thought processes as you're talking through all of this. And I wonder, I know we've got a small bit of an age difference, about 20 years or a little bit more, I think. But I wonder, Nadina, did you experience the same in terms of your family, going back to your grandparents, where it was normal in Ireland, certainly for me, for my grandmother to have spoken about like natural plants that might heal some ailment of some sort. So it's not that far back, is what I'm trying to say, since, it was relatable to think about plants as medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, my grandmother worked much the same way, and even my mom did to a certain degree. And that's something that I do believe has been lost in, let's say, the Gen Z millennial generation, or even further back than that. But I do see this huge resurgence. Like, I think there's a ton of interest in rediscovering, how do we make meals from scratch? I mean, look at just the sourdough bread revolution that we saw during COVID, when everybody started making their own bread at home. I mean, that was something that
Yeah.
was really, really commonplace, quote unquote, back in the day, that we've completely lost that skill because no one taught it to us, because our mothers or our fathers have lost that skill. In the same way that, like, much of like sewing has, gone by the radar, or things like, basic like bicycle repairs, or basic, electronics or appliance repairs. We've kind of lost in our world of consumerism and how easy it is to replace different things, and our obsession with everything new and having updates to these technologies and these things. I think we've lost sight of that. But I do believe that there's this huge resurgence, and you see it in things like people wanting to homestead, even in dense urban cores, people wanting to grow their own food, even on balconies. A new kind of resurgence in hunting and in like outdoor wilderness exploration and survivalist hunts. Like, I do feel like there's this huge kind of resurgence in interest in those things, as well as homemaking. And I do think that that is really beautiful, because so much of that knowledge, one, I think, makes our lives a lot more pleasant and a lot more beautiful to be able to also pass down that kind of wisdom and knowledge. And ultimately, I think nature has a lot of the answers. We just kind of have forgotten how to listen.
Absolutely. So that leads me on, Nadina, to chapter 6. And I really love the title you gave, The Scientist Within Us, which really is amazing in terms of encouraging citizen science and involvement. So we've kind of touched on that on some levels. What is the global urban wildlife exploration through the City Nature Challenge?
Yeah, I absolutely love this example of the City Nature Challenge, because I think so much when these monitoring tools and technologies, they often stay in the ivory tower of academia, and it feels difficult for your average citizen to take part. And what the City Nature Challenge does is it actually invites urban nights from all over the world every single year in this 4-day BioBlitz. It's typically at the end of April, beginning of May. And it started in 2016, so they just had their 9th edition in 2024. And it started as a simple rivalry, friendly-ish competition between Los Angeles and San Francisco. It was organized by the California Academy of Sciences and the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. And it was meant to use the app iNaturalist as a way to get citizens involved in these cities to basically photograph, identify, and upload as many observations of local biodiversity within the city limits to iNaturalist as possible. And this basically took off. It got more and more people involved every year. It grew from something that was only in these 2 cities to something that was only in California to something that was only in the US to something that has now just taken over the world. In the past edition in 2024, over 700 cities took part. I actually got to be a part of it in La Paz, not the capital, but the largest city in Bolivia. And La Paz has actually been crowned the winner of the City Nature Challenge for the past 3 years in a row. I got to be there with my National Geographic Explorer hat on, producing a documentary about the City Nature Challenge and what has led La Paz to these victories. And there's a couple of things that I learned. One, La Paz is one of the world's most biodiverse cities, right? So that makes winning something like this in terms of most species identified and the most observations made a little bit easier. But La Paz also won for having the most people involved, which is something that every city, of course, can compete in. And one of the ways that their secret weapon, if you will, that they were able to do this is they had a local organization, the Bolivian chapter of the Wildlife Conservation Society, get really involved and use their connections to involve almost every single high school and university and college in La Paz. So in these 4 days, it is, because it usually takes place, there's a Friday, and then there's a Saturday, Sunday, and then there's the Monday. So on the Friday and the Monday, they don't have school. Their school for that day is to go on a guided field trip to different national park, different parks, even on a street, like all these different areas that they designate. And they send buses full of students to these different areas on these field trips to go and identify as many species as possible. And then they have this as part of their curriculum for that season, where then they actually do projects based on the observations that they made. And I met this incredible biology teacher, Ms. Gladys. And Ms. Gladys, the biology teacher, she says to her students, like, it is not the end of your school day until you identify at least 200, not species, until you make at least 200 observations. And of course, you get more points the more species you do. So again, what we started this conversation with, Jackie, this idea of plant blindness, and I would say kind of flora and fauna blindness as a whole, what you're doing is you're taking youth, kids, out into their cities, the places where they live, where they grow up, where their families are from, every single year in this beautiful celebration of urban wildlife, and you're asking them directly to get involved, not only by taking their observations and learning about it, but also understanding what grows in their area and getting excited about it in a way that they can then tell their families and hopefully their children about it in the future. And it's just such a beautiful way, because urban nature already fights for that kind of recognition that it deserves. And what I love about this is this 4-day BioBlitz. It's almost like a holiday, a celebration of urban nature every year. And kudos to Allison Young and Lila Higgins, who initiated and started this challenge, all those years ago. And I know, speaking to Allison Young, she is blown away by how far it's gotten, the wide-reaching places that it's gone to, and the amount of people that get involved year over year. It's really quite something. I'll just name 2 favorite discoveries that I learned in La Paz. One was the Bolivian snake, which actually was thought to be extinct in La Paz. It actually hadn't been seen in La Paz for over 40 years. It had not been seen, and it was rediscovered by a high school student during the City Nature Challenge. They got a photo of it. So
That's just amazing.
It
Imagine how
was
the student must have felt.
It was shocking. I mean, a similar story happened in, I believe it was West Virginia. It was a pill bug that also was the same kind of story, thought to be extinct, hadn't been seen in decades by researchers, was also discovered by a 15-year-old student who her dad describes as being like totally phone addicted. She didn't want to do it, and her dad kind of made her do it with his phone, blah, blah, blah. She goes and she takes a photo of this pill bug. She completely has this like life altering moment. She not only does she publish academic findings together with people from the California Academy of Sciences in a peer reviewed science journal before she graduates high school, but she actually went on to study zoology as well.
That is just such an amazing story. And obviously, yeah, you can imagine that there's children or young people whose lives are turned around purely through this City Nature Challenge.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of that in the book as well. Like, there's another one with the Heat Watch campaign, which we discussed. I believe it was in episode 2. This idea we can do these hyper local measurements of heat and ambient temperature in your neighborhood, so that you can form better greening policy and better cooling strategies. There was a student there, because they try to involve high school students as much as possible in that project as well. There was a high school student that through that Heat Watch campaign discovered that his house on average was like 10 or 15 degrees hotter than his friend's house. And he was like, well, that makes sense, because we always go and play there in the summer because it's so much cooler in his backyard and on his street than it is on mine. He was so inspired by this. He was actually on the cusp of dropping out of school because his family was going through financial hardship, and he wanted to drop out of school and work in a store to help out his family. And the founder of Heat Watch, Vivek Chandas, got in touch with this student and actually started mentoring him. And now he's actually in an undergraduate program for environmental sciences. And Vivek just kept saying, and I believe I wrote this in the book, that like he can't wait to hire him when he graduates,
yes,
because he's so inspired by this story. And it just goes to show, like, there are so many beautiful, this is bigger than just changing, our environments and where we live, but there's also beautiful career opportunities for our young people here. And we're going to need this next generation of, Internet of Nature innovators or techno-ecologists to really, lead this avant-garde. And it's just amazing to see initiatives like this make that difference.
It absolutely is. I had a call yesterday from a lawyer based in England regarding the biodiversity net gain law that's obviously come out earlier in 2024 in February there. And that is just connected with the fact that he had a business idea to do with that. And we have a course that we've developed on that. And all of this is based on the fact that there is not anywhere near enough ecologists to go around just to handle that particular law. So it's a tiny little example of what you've said correctly, Nadina, which is that this generation coming up now, there's like wonderful opportunities for them to be massive change makers and involving themselves in nature, as you say, with the combination with technology, which is of course exactly what you talk about,
No, that's the thing. And we're going to need them. I mean, we needed them yesterday, and we definitely need them now. So I think what's amazing about this is it's kind of the next generation of young people that are die-hard environmentalists and nature lovers at heart, but also see the power that technology can help, win over people that need to be won over still, and also help them in their work. I think that's going to be quite critical. I see myself having to do less and less convincing about the powerful ways that technology can help us in this fight, and more have that be something that's second nature.
Absolutely. I think that should be the case, hopefully, Nadine, as you say. Now, we've covered a lot again, which is brilliant, and we've one more episode for our listeners to look forward to, which is going to be focused very much around health and health strategies and practices about integrating, daily doses of nature, hopefully, for those people who can manage it, and how that can affect human health. So obviously looking forward to that, and we'll be chatting again very soon, Nadina. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackie.
This is Constructive Voices.